December 19, 1944. A cold stone room in northern France. 16 officers, 4 of them British, sit in wooden chairs around a map-covered wall. They are smoking cigarettes, pipes, cigars. The room smells of stale tobacco and fear. The weather outside is brutal. Snow, sleet, fog. The kind of winter that kills men as surely as bullets. And right now, more than 100,000 American soldiers are being slaughtered in the Ardennes forest, caught in the largest German offensive of the war. A surprise attack that has ripped a massive hole in the Allied lines. Everyone in that room knows what is at stake. If the Germans reach Antwerp, they will split the Allied forces in half. The war could be lost. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower asked the question that has no good answer. How long will it take to turn the Third Army north and counterattack? A 3-star general named General Patton, cigar in hand, answers without hesitation. 48 hours. A few of the British officers laugh. They think he is joking. He is not. Be sure to subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another story like this one. To understand why those British officers laughed, you need to know 3 things. First, armies do not turn on a dime. Moving 100,000 men with all their tanks, trucks, artillery, ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies is not like making a U-turn in your car. Military doctrine at the time suggested that reorienting a force the size of Patton's Third Army, disengaging from one front and attacking on another at a 90-degree angle, should take at least a week of planning and coordination, probably longer. Some experts said 2 weeks would be more realistic. What Patton was proposing was not ambitious. It was, in the minds of most professional soldiers present, impossible. Second, the weather was a nightmare. The Ardennes in December of 1944 experienced one of the coldest winters in European memory. Temperatures dropped well below freezing. Roads were covered in ice. Fog and low clouds grounded all Allied aircraft, which meant no reconnaissance, no air support, no help from the sky. Moving an army under these conditions would be treacherous even under ideal planning circumstances. Third, the Third Army was already engaged in heavy fighting. They were not sitting in reserve waiting for orders. They were in the middle of their own offensive toward the Saar River, pushing into Germany itself. Patton was proposing to halt that attack, pull back his forces, swing them north through Belgium, and launch a full-scale counterattack against battle-hardened German panzer divisions, all within 2 days. Now, with that in mind, let me tell you how he did it. George Smith Patton Jr. was born to be a warrior. His family traced its military lineage back to the Revolutionary War. And young George grew up hearing stories of ancestors who had fought for both the Union and the Confederacy. By the time he graduated from West Point in 1909, he had already decided that his purpose in life was to achieve glory on the battlefield. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in Stockholm, finishing 5th in the modern pentathlon. He designed a cavalry saber still named after him. He was the first American officer assigned to the Tank Corps in World War I, where he was wounded leading his men in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. This was a man who had prepared his entire life for the moment that was about to come. But Patton was also deeply controversial. He was profane, vulgar, and theatrical in ways that made many of his fellow officers uncomfortable. He wore ivory-handled pistols on his hips and dressed in uniforms so immaculate. They seemed designed for Hollywood rather than combat. He cursed so frequently and creatively that his speeches became infamous. His troops called him Old Blood and Guts, though some of them grumbled that it was their blood and his guts. In 1943, he had slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue in a field hospital in Sicily, calling them cowards. The scandal nearly ended his career. Eisenhower had to bench him for months, keeping him sidelined during the D-Day landings, as commander of a fictitious army meant to deceive the Germans. Yet beneath the bluster and the showmanship was a military mind of exceptional quality. Patton studied history obsessively. He believed in reincarnation and was convinced he had been a soldier in previous lives, fighting with Caesar, with Napoleon, with the great captains of history. More practically, he understood mechanized warfare in ways that few other commanders did. He grasped that speed and aggression could compensate for inferior numbers, that hesitation was more dangerous than risk, that the enemy should never be given time to think. His chief of staff later said that Patton was one of those rare generals who could feel the flow of battle instinctively, who knew when to push and when to pause. By December 1944, Patton had already proven himself in North Africa, Sicily, and the breakout from Normandy. But what he was about to do would cement his reputation forever. The key to understanding Patton at this moment is this: he was already prepared. While other commanders were shocked by the German offensive, Patton had seen it coming. His intelligence officer, Colonel Oskar Koch, had been tracking unusual German movements for weeks. As early as November 25th, Patton had written in his diary, expressing concern about the quiet in the Ardennes sector. He ordered his staff to begin preparing contingency plans for a northward attack, just in case. By the time Eisenhower called the meeting at Verdun, Patton had 3 different attack plans already drafted, each with its own code word. He was not improvising. He was executing a plan he had been developing in secret for days. At 5:30 in the morning on December 16, 1944, the German army unleashed its final great offensive of the war. More than 200,000 troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and over 2,000 artillery pieces, smashed into a 75-mile stretch of the Allied line in the Ardennes forest. The attack caught the Americans completely by surprise. The sector was lightly defended, held mainly by exhausted units that had been sent there to rest, and inexperienced divisions that had never seen combat. Within hours, the American line was shattered. The Germans had chosen their moment perfectly. The weather was terrible, with thick clouds, fog, and snow that grounded all Allied aircraft. American intelligence had completely missed the build-up. The attack hit at the seam between 2 American armies, exploiting a gap that commanders had assumed the rugged Ardennes terrain would naturally defend. It was a catastrophic failure of planning and intelligence, and American soldiers paid for it in blood. The situation was even worse than it first appeared. The Germans were not just attacking. They were racing toward specific objectives with terrifying speed. Their goal was the port of Antwerp, through which most Allied supplies were flowing. To reach it, they needed to capture the road junctions in the Ardennes, particularly the towns of Saint-Vith and Bastogne. Bastogne was especially critical. 7 major roads converged there, making it the gateway to the west. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the entire region. By December 19th, when Eisenhower convened his commanders at Verdun, the news was grim. German spearheads had penetrated more than 40 miles into Allied territory. American units were being surrounded and destroyed. Thousands of soldiers were dead, wounded, or captured. The 106th Infantry Division had virtually ceased to exist, with more than 8,000 men taken prisoner in one of the largest mass surrenders in American history. At Malmedy, German troops had executed 84 American prisoners of war in cold blood. The Allied High Command was in crisis. The strategic town of Bastogne was already surrounded. The 101st Airborne Division, rushed to the town in open trucks through the freezing night, had arrived just 4 hours ahead of the German forces. Now they were trapped. 17,000 Americans, including elements of the 10th Armored Division and various other units, were holding a shrinking perimeter against relentless German attacks. They were running low on everything: ammunition, food, medical supplies, cold weather gear. Their wounded were dying because there was not enough plasma or morphine, and the weather meant no supplies could be dropped by air. Eisenhower understood that Bastogne was the key. If it fell, the Germans would have a clear path to the Meuse River and potentially to Antwerp. The entire Allied position in Western Europe could collapse. Something had to be done, and it had to be done immediately. But what? Most of the available forces were either engaged in the fighting or too far away to help. The one major force that might be able to intervene was Patton's Third Army, currently 150 miles to the south, engaged in its own offensive into Germany. Could they get there in time? The meeting at Verdun took place in a cold stone building that had once been a French army barracks. The senior commanders of the Allied forces in Europe gathered around a large map, their breath visible in the frigid air. Despite the small stove in the corner, most of them kept their coats on. The mood was tense. Outside, the snow was falling. Inside, careers and perhaps the war itself hung in the balance. Eisenhower opened the meeting with words that surprised many in the room. He said that the present situation was to be regarded as one of opportunity for them, not disaster. Some of the officers exchanged glances. The Germans had just launched the biggest offensive in months. Thousands of Americans were dead or captured, and Ike was talking about opportunity. But Eisenhower understood something crucial. The Germans had come out of their defensive positions. They were exposed. If the Allies could hit them from the flanks before they reached their objectives, they could turn this disaster into a trap. The question was how. Eisenhower laid out the plan. Montgomery's forces would attack from the north, but the critical blow would come from the south, where Patton's Third Army could strike into the flank of the German advance and relieve Bastogne. Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George," he said, "I want you to command this move. How long will it take?" What happened next would become one of the most famous moments in American military history. Patton did not hesitate. He did not ask for time to consult with his staff. He did not hedge or qualify his answer. He said he could attack with 2 divisions within 48 hours. The room fell silent. Then a few of the British officers laughed. The idea was preposterous. You could not turn an entire army 90 degrees and launch a major offensive in 2 days. It could not be done. But Patton was not joking, and he was not exaggerating. What the others in that room did not know was that the movement had already begun. Before leaving for the meeting, Patton had given his deputy, Major General Hobart Gay, 3 code words, corresponding to 3 different attack plans. All Gay needed was a phone call telling him which plan to execute. The 4th Armored Division was already preparing to move. The staff work was already done. Patton had anticipated this moment and prepared for it. Eisenhower was skeptical but not dismissive. He knew Patton's reputation for recklessness, but he also knew his capabilities. He told Patton not to attack piecemeal, to wait until he had sufficient force assembled. "Make it 3 days," Ike said. "Start on the 22nd. Patton agreed, though he chafed at even this short delay. As Patton was leaving the meeting, he stopped to place a phone call. He reached Gay and spoke a single code word. It was time to execute the plan. Within hours, 133,000 vehicles would be on the move, heading north through the snow and ice toward Bastogne. The largest and fastest 90-degree turn of an entire army in military history had begun. The logistical challenges were staggering. Patton's staff had to establish dozens of new supply depots and ammunition dumps along the new axis of advance. They shifted 63,000 tons of supplies in 5 days. They moved an average of 4,500 tons of ammunition per day. They distributed hundreds of thousands of new maps, weighing 57 tons in all. They strung 20,000 miles of communication wire. They reconnoitered 2,800 miles of roads, and they did all of this while the army itself was in motion, with units disengaging from combat, wheeling north and preparing to attack again, all in the worst winter weather in memory. Meanwhile, Patton himself drove the roads between units, pushing his commanders, checking on his troops, appearing everywhere at once. He was tireless and relentless. When he encountered a column of trucks moving too slowly, he stopped the lead vehicle and ordered the driver to remove his trailer so he could move faster. When he found soldiers who seemed to be lacking urgency, he cursed them into motion. He was everywhere, a profane, theatrical, ivory-handled tornado of aggression and will. On December 22nd, as promised, the attack began. But the Germans were not cooperating. They fought back hard. The advance toward Bastogne was slower than Patton had hoped. His lead division, the 4th Armored, ran into fierce resistance from German paratroopers and faced landmines, shell craters, and roads turned to ice by the brutal cold. The weather remained terrible. Fog and overcast skies continued to ground the Allied air forces. Every mile gained cost blood. If you're enjoying this story, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now so you don't miss what happens next. Inside Bastogne, the situation was desperate. The 101st Airborne and its attached units were holding a shrinking perimeter against constant German attacks. On December 22nd, the same day Patton's offensive began, German officers approached the American lines under a white flag. They carried a written message demanding the surrender of the town within 2 hours. If the Americans refused the message promised, they faced total annihilation. The message was brought to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the acting commander of the 101st. McAuliffe had been napping when his chief of staff woke him with the news. When he heard what the Germans were demanding, he laughed. His first response, according to those present, was a single word: nuts. But then he realized he needed to send a formal reply. He sat thinking for several minutes, unsure what to write. One of his officers reminded him of his initial reaction. "So you said nuts, that would be hard to beat." McAuliffe wrote it down. The official American reply to the German surrender demand was a single word, typed on a piece of paper, and delivered to the waiting German officers: nuts. When the Germans asked what it meant, the American colonel who delivered it explained, "In plain English, it means the same as go to hell." The German officers saluted stiffly and returned to their lines. The attack resumed. The next day, December 23rd, the weather finally broke. For the first time in a week, the skies cleared over the Ardennes. It was, in the words of one American soldier, the war's most beautiful sunrise. Allied aircraft immediately took to the skies. C-47 transport planes dropped desperately needed supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. Fighter bombers attacked German positions and supply lines. The Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, came up to challenge them but was badly outnumbered and outfought. The weather had turned, and with it, the tide of the battle. Patton, watching the clear skies, was jubilant. For weeks he had been praying for good weather. He had even ordered his chief chaplain, Father James O'Neill, to compose a special prayer asking God to restrain the rains. When the weather cleared, Patton declared that O'Neill had done some potent praying, and later awarded him a Bronze Star for it, making him perhaps the only man in World War II to receive a medal for writing a prayer. But the 4th Armored Division was still fighting its way toward Bastogne, and progress remained slow. By December 25th, Christmas Day, they were still 5 miles short of the besieged town. Patton was growing frustrated. He had promised to relieve Bastogne, and his men were dying trying to keep that promise. The 4th Armored had already suffered heavy casualties, and the lead tank battalion, the 37th, was down to only 20 operational medium tanks. On the morning of December 26th, the commander of the 37th Tank Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, stood on a hill and gazed north toward Bastogne. He could see American cargo planes dropping supplies into the surrounded town. His battalion had been fighting for days, taking heavy losses, but they were close now, only 5 miles away. Abrams made a decision. He would try one final push, a direct assault down the road to Bastogne, regardless of what lay in his path. Abrams radioed his division commander for permission. It was granted. At shortly after 3 in the afternoon, Abrams stuck a cigar in his mouth, climbed into his Sherman tank named Thunderbolt 4, and gave the order. "We are going into those people now. Let her roll." What followed was a hell ride. American artillery pounded the route ahead, firing 2,340 shells into enemy positions. The tanks and infantry of the 37th Tank Battalion and the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion raced forward, guns blazing. They highballed through the village of Cloquemont, fighting their way through German defenders. They blasted through the next village, S.L.A, where German soldiers were dug in with machine guns and anti-tank weapons. Thick woods concealed enemy bunkers on both sides of the road. At the head of the column was a Sherman tank called Cobra King, commanded by First Lieutenant Charles Boggis. Cobra King smashed through S.L.A, destroying a German bunker, and kept going. Beyond the village, Boggis spotted figures in American uniforms near the tree line. He called out to them, wary of a trap. The Germans had been using captured American uniforms to cause confusion. But a voice called back, "I am Lieutenant Webster, of the 326th Airborne Engineers, 101st Airborne Division. Glad to see you." It was 4:50 in the afternoon on December 26th, 1944. 7 days after the laughing British officers at Verdun, Patton's Third Army had broken through the German lines and reached Bastogne. The siege was over. The relief of Bastogne did not end the battle. The corridor that Cobra King had punched through was narrow and vulnerable. German forces counterattacked repeatedly, trying to close it again. Fierce fighting continued for weeks. The 101st Airborne, which had never admitted to needing rescue in the first place, remained on the line, fighting to expand the American perimeter. The full Battle of the Bulge would not officially end until January 25, 1945. But the relief of Bastogne marked the turning point. By holding the town, the Americans had denied the Germans the road network they needed to reach Antwerp. By reaching Bastogne when they did, Patton's forces had stopped, the German offensive in its tracks. The enemy's last gamble had failed. From this point forward, the Germans would only retreat. The cost had been staggering. The Battle of the Bulge became the largest and bloodiest battle fought by the United States in World War II. American casualties totaled approximately 89,000, including 19,000 killed. The 101st Airborne alone suffered more than 2,000 casualties during the siege. The 4th Armored Division lost about 1,000 men killed and wounded in the relief operation. But the German losses were even worse, and unlike the Americans, the Germans could not replace what they had lost. Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice that the relief of Bastogne was the most brilliant operation we have thus far performed. General Eisenhower would later describe the Third Army's pivot as one of the most astonishing feats of generalship in the war. Military historians have studied it ever since as an example of what determined leadership and meticulous staff work can achieve under impossible conditions. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, the tank commander who led the final charge into Bastogne, would go on to become one of the most important figures in American military history. He rose to 4-star general, commanded American forces in Vietnam, and served as Army Chief of Staff. The M1 Abrams tank, the main battle tank of the United States Army, is named in his honor. And Patton, he would lead the Third Army across the Rhine and deep into Germany, racing the Soviets to liberate prisoners and capture territory. He would famously stop on a bridge over the Rhine to urinate in the river, a gesture of contempt for the enemy. He would die less than a year after the war ended, from injuries sustained in a car accident in Germany. He is buried in the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, among the soldiers he led. What does it mean to do the impossible? In December 1944, George Patton moved an army in a way that military doctrine said could not be done. He did it because he had prepared for a crisis that others had not foreseen. He did it because his staff had planned for contingencies that seemed unlikely. He did it because he understood that in war, speed and audacity can overcome obstacles that appear insurmountable. And he did it because at the moment when doubt would have been easiest, he chose certainty instead. Those British officers who laughed at Verdun were not fools. They were professionals who understood the normal limits of military operations. What they did not understand was Patton. They did not know that he had spent his entire life preparing for exactly this kind of moment. They did not know about the contingency plans, the staff work, the pre-positioned supplies. They saw a boastful general making an impossible promise. What they were actually seeing was a master of war about to execute his masterpiece. We remember Patton for his profanity, his pistols, his theatrical personality. But the real Patton was the one who anticipated the Battle of the Bulge before it happened, who prepared plans while others relaxed, who moved heaven and earth and 63,000 tons of supplies to keep his word. The real Patton was the one who understood that leadership is not about what you say in the moment of crisis. It is about what you have done in all the moments before. If you enjoyed this story, I have many more like it. Stories of men and women who faced impossible odds and found ways to overcome them. Stories from the great conflicts that shaped our world. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new video. Drop a comment below and let me know what historical moments you would like me to cover next. And as always, thank you for watching. Until next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, history is not just about the past. It is about the choices that define who we are.